All right, so we are joined by Tristan Gooley. I'm so happy to have him here, naturalnavigator.com. Tristan, welcome to the show. You're one of the crown jewels of my summer schedule here because it's just your work is incredible, your resume is incredible, and I think that you have a lot of information that average people could really use in ways they don't even expect.
Thanks for having me on, Frank. Really looking forward to chatting.
A prolific writer. You got a lot of books out in your library. I know you have one that you just released recently, and we'll talk about that in a second. And I have ordered your books for my personal collection, but I'm starting to think that I'm starting to wonder, I should say, whether they belong in my library or in my emergency bag, because this is really an anthology of basic survival skills, if you think about it, at least as far as situational awareness goes.
It's really interesting you say that, but actually my philosophy is a bit different. So these skills will definitely help you in a survival or emergency situation. And there are a lot of survivalists who enjoy my work, and I'm grateful for that. But the truth is, I write for a broader situation. I wouldn't even say a broader sort of readership, because I'm thinking of normal times outdoors. Because a lot of these skills, if we think we're going to be in the unlucky, 1/10 of 1% who end up in a nasty situation, we miss a lot of the fun. Because you can learn to navigate using the sun, you can read patterns in the water, you can understand plants and animals on an average, walk. I mean, I train people from all backgrounds. Some of them just want to add a layer to their kind of Sunday fresh air. Some of them are doing some quite hardcore stuff. But the way to enjoy it is actually not to imagine that these skills are for when it all goes wrong. They're actually for when it's all going right.
That's a wonderful. Now that is an interesting and wonderful way of putting it, and I was thinking about that too, as I was just thinking about things I wanted to talk to you about, because I had to imagine that this leads to a general increase in just enjoyment, just because knowledge, whatever it is, especially advanced knowledge of something, anything, it adds a certain level of confidence in your walk. I mean, just to know that you just, I don't know, you feel more in tune with things around you, and I think that that is a lot when it comes to our connection to nature and being able to read nature, which is what you really do. That is adding a layer of things that have been stripped away from us for a while now. And I think that the more that we get back to nature and knowing what exactly we're looking at, we start feeling a little bit more connected again, and we start realizing that it's really home. That we're connecting to home, and we're not separate from it. I think everybody feels at one sense or another that we are outside of nature.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying there. And if I can just pick up on two words you used, connecting and the word read. So I think most people these days feel we've become a bit distanced from the natural environment. The modern lifestyle is driving a wedge between us and the way our ancestors experienced the outdoors. So there's this very widespread sense that reconnecting with nature would be a positive thing, positive physically, mentally, absolutely every way we can think of it. But then what tends to happen is people kind of like, they walk out the front door and they have this sense of, well, I should be connecting with nature. How exactly does that work? You can't, there's no USB port for connecting with nature. So how do you actually do that? So then I come to the word read, because my work is all about deduction. It's all about the idea that every single thing we sense outdoors, mostly what we see, but also what we hear, smell, occasionally what we taste, and what we feel, is giving us messages, basically. And my whole philosophy is every single thing we sense outdoors will tell us something. It is a sign, it is a clue. And I welcome anyone, including you, Frank, just to pick anything random, something you've seen in the last week, throw it at me. We haven't prepared this at all. You'll confirm that. And I will show you how my mind works when I'm dealing with anything outdoors. So go on, just for fun, just throw something at me, something you've seen outdoors. You can't be right or wrong, just anything you've seen.
Okay. Let me see. Oh, I wanted to ask you about dewdrops. I was showing my 3-year-old daughter the other day. She was wondering why the grass is wet. I said, "Oh, that's dew." She said, "Dew?" Now it's one thing to say, "Oh, it's condensation," all that, but what can you glean from that?
Yeah, I think we've all had that experience, whether it's a family camping trip or an expedition or how, just walking out in the morning, and sometimes there's the wet layer on some grass, and you notice your shoes getting wet, and then 24 hours later you do exactly the same thing and the ground is dry. So what's happening is, as you say, there's moisture in the air all the time. The amount varies, but there's always moisture in the air. So if the grass gets cool enough, the gaseous moisture condenses and forms dewdrops. But why does that do? Why does it do it sometimes and not other times? Well, it comes down to heat escaping from the ground. And we can think of times, there are times when there's a blanket over the ground, a layer of clouds, and we can think of that like a sheet over our bed. It keeps the warmth in. So if you've had a cloudy night, you don't find dew in the morning. But on a morning with lots of dew on the ground, if you go for a very, very short walk, you'll start to notice it's not everywhere. So the second there's a tree, the dew disappears because the tree is acting as that sheet, that blanket, keeping the warmth in. So dew is a simple sign that we've had clear skies the night before, and that there's a clear line from that patch of ground, quite often grass, to the sky. If anything gets between the ground and the sky, whether it's a cloud, a leaf, something we leave out on a lawn perhaps, there won't be dew there. So it's a simple sign. It's telling us what the weather has been doing normally, and then that gives us a high probability of fair weather. It doesn't guarantee it, but if you've had a clear night which creates the dew, there's a high probability that you're going to have good weather.
And again, like you said in the opening, when I alluded to survivalism, this is not necessarily something that this is not a survival skill or anything, but it just knowing that is, you go to the doctor to talk about, you take your vital signs, you understand your body, what's going on. There's just things you understand why things are. This is that knowing is part of the connection of, I understand this place, I know how it works, and that's it, and it's really cool in that respect because the education is just, it's just priceless. Well, let's stick with water, because I know that you wrote about the secret world of weather, and I was wondering about those smaller bodies of water. Everybody talks about hurricane tracking. That's all people want to talk about these days. Let's track some hurricanes. What about making our way up from dewdrops? What about just ponds and puddles and babbling brooks?
Yeah, I focused on water in a book called How to Read Water. It does what it says on the tin, and that book came about because I'd spent years practicing and studying navigation on quite a big scale. I've sailed small boats on some quite big journeys, and as part of my passion and research for natural navigation, I of course came across the Pacific Island navigators. But I also researched the Vikings, the Arab navigators, went deep into history. And what I found was they had incredible skills. And in my mind, these skills for many years sat in a box. This is what you do if you're in the Pacific. This is what you do if you're in the North Atlantic. And then this extraordinary thing happened to me when I was walking past a pond in the south of England, in my home county of Sussex. And I saw a pattern in the water, and I went, I know that pattern. And all that was happening was the breeze had set up some ripples, which behave exactly the same as ocean waves, just a different scale. And they were bending around a small island of lilies, the floating leaves on the surface of the pond. And it created the same patterns that Pacific Island navigators use to sense land when they're well beyond visual range. So a Pacific Island navigator, historically, and a few to this day, can lie on the deck of an outrigger canoe, close their eyes and sense the motion of the waves and say, this rhythm now is different. We are getting reflected swell off land. I know where the island is. And there are 5 simple patterns that form around an island. Their reflection and refraction, the bending. And once you know them, I often think of these signs as characters. And as we get to know characters, if we like them, they become friends. And I'd befriended this pattern, and I'd seen it in oceans, both on a boat and from land. And then I suddenly saw it in a pond. So that drove me it helped me cross a massive bridge from thinking these skills, as I say, they don't sit in a box and you pull them out when you're in the Pacific or the North Atlantic. They're transferable, they're portable skills. So the joy is, whether we're practicing looking at dewdrops or looking at ripples in a pond or even a puddle, this is sharpening our awareness. It is rekindling the part of our brain. I mean, we were born to do this stuff. The modern lifestyle tries to trick us into thinking we weren't, but this is what our brain really wants to do.
Oh, well, when you mentioned the Vikings, the Viking navigation methods, did this precede your crossing? Because I know that you crossed the Atlantic single-handed. I'd love to know about the boat you used, how long it's like, just the conditions, and what are the what skills and what that you employed the most as you're making your way across the Atlantic by yourself. So it was the Viking navigation study part of the what would be your expedition across, or have it all linked together?
So my personal relationship and journey through navigation started with being restless, really enjoying the process of going on expeditions, then realizing that the bit I actually liked was shaping and planning the journey. You know, there are lots of us who just enjoy. People don't use paper maps as much as they used to, but when I was growing up, that was very much the go-to. And, you know, spreading that map on a table and going, I am here, this is how I'm going to get there. And I fell in love with navigation. It took me a few years to realize that. I mean, I've been walking and jumping in boats and things like that for many years before I realized that navigation was the thing that excited me. But once I realized that was my passion, I decided to try and, you know, master it as best I could. And I did that by setting myself goals of increasing ambition. But I didn't really have any interest in the scale of the journey. I didn't have any interest in trying to do anything, you know, courageous or crazy or bold. I was interested in I wanted to put my head on the pillow at the end of the day and say, I am a good navigator. And the way I convinced myself that the only way I felt I could do that was not by getting bits of paper, by setting myself goals. So I sailed small boats to lots and lots of different places, and then I set myself this goal of sailing a small boat, 32-foot yacht, across the Atlantic, and then flying a single-engine aircraft back across the North Atlantic. And that really was about, as I say, making, you know, it was my own course I'd set myself, basically. I wanted to feel I'd mastered navigation. Now, the irony was that took 7 years from a basis of being a decent navigator to getting to that point. And during that time, I didn't fall out of love with conventional navigation. I will always love the traditional and the modern skills. But I started to realize that instead of things getting more fun, you end up staring at screens. So, for example, to fly an aircraft solo on that sort of journey, you have to pass flight tests and exams which prove you can fly without looking out of the window, and an instrument rating, which is the opposite of what I was trying to do. I was trying to enjoy the journey through the world, and you end up staring at a bank of screens and dials. So that led me to natural navigation, and so I fell in love with natural navigation whilst I was completing my own self-imposed goals, and so. It was a sort of, with hindsight, it looks like there was a plan that lasted 25 years. But actually, like most people, I just woke up in the morning and think, this is what I'd quite like to do today, and this is what I'd quite like to have done by the end of the year. And it just took me in a direction that I couldn't have predicted, but quite a fun one.
I was wondering about your upbringing, and I was going to ask you about that too. I personally, me and my brother and our friends in childhood, we loved maps too. It didn't matter where we can get them. I'd always ask my mother to buy us road maps whenever we would go into a stationery store. For no other reason than it was just awesome to look at them and to pretend that we were doing something. We make maps of the backyard, and so I was just wondering, is this something that, were you in the Scouts? Did you have a military background? What was it? But, you know, just that childhood passion realized is just as good as anything else, because those are the ones that usually take you farthest when they're so pure. Let me ask you about being up in the air, though. It's one thing to put all of your natural navigation skills to rely on them in a boat. But when you are up there with all that instrumentation, do you just go through the study, pass the test, learn how to fly the plane, and then once you're up there, are you trying to spend a little bit more time? What are you tracking? Once you're up in the air, you're licensed and you're up there, what are you looking for to get to where you want to go without relying totally on the instruments in front of you?
Yeah, it's in aviation. There's a legal requirement to use the instruments for good reason. You're endangering yourself and others if you don't. But that doesn't mean you can't actually make yourself safer and make it more interesting by having a complementary layer of awareness.
Hmm.
So to give you one very sort of fundamental basic example, as I took off from Goose Bay in Newfoundland, push the throttle forward, off we go. I'm actually squinting and struggling to see through the windscreen because I'm taking off into a rising sun. Now I'm taking off northeast, and it's May, and people with plenty of outdoors experience know the sun rises north of east in the summer and rises well south of east in the winter. But there are many people who don't, and including a lot of pilots. I speak to a lot of pilots who are extremely safe, competent pilots, but they genuinely don't know where the sun rises. And so I didn't need to know that it made sense, the fact that I could barely see forward because of the sun pouring in through into my eyes. But it helped me, connect with I had probably, a dozen different dials and screens and things bleeping at me. But the fact that the brightness made sense, I was connecting with it. In the unlikely event that the kit did go down, I wouldn't suddenly think there's no way I can work out which way to go. So it's in all situations, whether it's a short walk on the weekend or an expedition right at the edge. Natural navigation doesn't have to be the primary skill, but it can always be a complementary one. What I often say to people is whatever kit you're using, might be a traditional compass, it might be a smartphone, it might be, over the years, I've had to use about 25 bits of kit with 3-letter, acronyms. Any of these amazing bits of kit. Before, if you're not in a hurry and there's not an immediate safety issue, before you let the kit give you the answer, see if your senses will do it. Before you let the compass tell you which way is north, ask the tree next to you which way is north, and you'll probably find there's a pretty strong answer.
That I'm glad you brought that up, especially with the sun rising in the east, setting in the west, because I wanted to ask you about situations in places like the woods. Now, this could just be, again, for general enjoyment. It's also just a good skill going into a patch of land that is undeveloped and can be very disorienting, because that's something that people deal with all the time. There's so many stories around here about people getting lost and dying in the woods less than a mile from where they parked their car, just because they can't get their bearings. So starting with the sun, I know it's not the only information you need to be able to get back to a parked car, but starting with the sun, the best all I ever could say was, we know that when the sun rises, it's in the east. So we can at least figure out where east and west is, and then from there deduce other things. But as you say, it's not always perfectly due east throughout the year, and that's something that most people would have to tune themselves to. But what about nighttime? How useful is the moon in all of its movement, in all of its phases? Aside from a light source, how are you using the moon? Then I'd love to talk about constellations.
Yeah, there are 3 methods I use to navigate using the moon. The first one I share with people is called the crescent method. And when you see a crescent moon, imagine a line that touches the horns of the moon, a tangent that just touches both horns, and you extend that down to your horizon, and you'll be looking roughly south if you're in the northern hemisphere. The higher the moon is, the more dependable this method. As the crescent moon gets lower, it becomes less accurate. But it's the sort of thing that takes, you might have to think for a few seconds the first 2 or 3 times you use it, and then your brain will just take over, which is something I've written about as well. Our brain likes to take shortcuts. It was born to do this. It doesn't want to make this stuff difficult, because our ancestors, they didn't want to sit an exam every time they had to find their way home. This stuff has to be quick and easy. So that's a very easy method with the moon. There are more complex methods. There's a thing called the phase method, which is the shape of the moon is telling you where it is relative to the sun, and we can always estimate what direction the sun is. So if we take a simple example, if you see half of the moon is bright, let's say the right-hand half of the moon is bright, that's, in astronomy terms, that's called a first quarter moon, which is confusing, but it just means it's a quarter of the cycle. Now that is going to lag the sun. It's going to be 90 degrees behind the sun. So when we see that moon, let's say it's September, it's 6 p.m., the sun is setting in the west, and we see a first quarter moon, west 270 degrees. That moon is 90 degrees behind that, i.e., lagging it. It's due south. Now, that's the first time anyone hears these sorts of things. They think, "Oh God, do I really want to sort of be doing what sounds like a maths exam?"
Exactly.
Yeah, but this is or anything that's new. There is that little bump in the road as you start the learning, and then once you do it a few times, your brain just sort of says, "Don't work too hard. I've got this sorted." And there's to give you an even simpler example, a full moon is full because it's opposite the sun. So we see a full moon rising in the east as the sun sets in the west, and we see a full moon setting in the west as the sun rises in the east, because the full moon is opposite. So the sun is due south. If we're north of the tropics, the sun is due south in the middle of the day. The full moon is due south in the middle of the night, because by that point the sun is due north. We can't see it. That's why it's the middle of the night. But the first time we hear any of this stuff, it's like, ooh, I've got enough stuff going on. Do I really want to sort of, take up space in my brain? But trust me, it's a tiny bit of kind of like curiosity, a few seconds thinking, do it a couple of times, and then your brain sort of goes, yeah, this is, I don't know what the fuss is about. This is easy. Why did anybody invent a compass? I can do this.
Yeah, it's more so about once you start understanding how the motion of everything above you, it starts to make better sense. And maybe if you don't know the numbers, the actual angles and all that, you still get you have your bearings, and that's what you're ultimately looking for. What about constellations? And then I want to get back down to surface level questions, but some key constellations as far as direction and navigation goes. That's number one. And then anything else you have about constellations as far as connectedness and just general did you know?
Okay, so the way people are first introduced to navigating using the stars is not a bad way. Typically, is you find this pattern in the sky. It's not technically a constellation. It's just this shape. Most people in North America call it the Big Dipper, but every culture has its own name for it. There's no right name for it. And it looks a bit like a saucepan. And if you imagine lifting up the handle of the saucepan with some milk in, the two stars that the milk would run off are your pointer stars. You go from the bottom one to the top one, continue that for 5 times that distance, and you find the North Star. And the point below that on your horizon is within 1 degree of true north. Saying it verbally, it's quite hard to sort of picture, but if you look at in my books, there are always illustrations of these techniques, because when you're talking about stars and the moon, you learn much faster with a picture or two. And again, you do that a few times, and there's this fantastic couple of moments that tend to come when people have practiced that, maybe 3 or 4 times. So the first couple of times somebody does it, there's this very healthy sort of skepticism, kind of like, this can't really work, can it? So people tend to get out something to check, a smartphone or a compass or something like that. Now, this is very interesting, because what they're doing is a interesting cultural thing. They're basically saying, I trust the bit of kit in my hands more than the night sky. Now, this moment comes, and it's quite soon, where you realize that the North Star is far more dependable than the bit of kit. Put another way, if you pull out a compass and you point it at the North Star, and the compass is telling you that's east, what's got the problem, the star or the compass? The compass. The compass is knackered. But that's a shift from the very sort of modern contemporary mindset, where bits of kit and computers are going to kind of solve problems for me, to the traditional understanding where, by the time the North Star is north, it won't be in a few thousand years. But if it wasn't tonight, we've got bigger problems than navigation. So that's you then reach the point where you're actually checking your kit against the star. So if you've got to worry your smartphone compass isn't working and you know how to find the North Star, you can check your smartphone compass. It's not the compass that's right, it's the star that's right, if you see what I mean.
I do, and I this explains why my observing the night sky has gone so poorly the last couple of years, because I was obviously it's wrong, but I thought that it was the last star on the ladle that pointed out toward. So I wasn't looking at the actual. Well, no. The handle, the ladle's the actual dipper there. I was looking at the wrong star. So yeah, I guess I would be going west. It's something, but that makes a lot.
Depends on the time, because the saucepan or the Big Dipper wheels anti-clockwise around the North Star. So the North Star's pretty much fixed, and the reason it's telling us north is because it's directly over the North Pole. Put another way, if you're standing at the North Pole and look directly above your head, you'd see the North Star. And when we say north, what we really mean is towards the North Pole. It doesn't matter, if you're on a mad expedition crossing a Utah desert, or if you're strolling around in Central Park. If you use the word north, you mean towards the North Star. And so the North Star works because it is sitting directly, we mean towards the North Pole, and the North Star is sitting directly over the North Pole. So the analogy I sometimes use is if you're planning to meet somebody and you walk over a hill and you're planning to meet them under a very tall street light, as you walk over this gently curving hill, you see the street light before you see the person, and you say, I can point to where they are even though you can't see them. So when we point towards the North Star, we're pointing towards the North Pole because we're looking at the light that's directly above the North Pole. I find in natural navigation you have to try lots of different sort of ways of looking at these things, because we all learn in different ways. Some people are more visual, and the way I teach and the way I write is to kind of throw loads of different ways of cracking a nut, and different ones work for different people. But we can all do this stuff. None of us would exist today if this wasn't doable, because all our ancestors could do this. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived. So we know we can do it. It's just like learning anything new, whether it's kind of language, music, whatever it is. Navigation, you have to expect the very first few times you do it, it feels a little bit like a challenge, but very, very quickly, and I'm talking quite often seconds, it starts to feel comfortable.
Well, it's very obvious that as far as determining north, south, east, and west, there's a number of tools that are at your disposal there. Is there anything else that the skies can any kind of stories or information, useful information, or just information to enjoy knowing that the skies at night or otherwise could unlock? Anything that off the top of your head that you think would be cool to know?
Yeah, there's a nice simple way of looking at the night sky, which is that every single pattern of stars can help you find your way. And there's a reason for that, because there are certain stars that give us a very strong sense of direction. And let's just stick with the North Star for now, but I'm going to introduce a different idea, which is that if you open up a map of the world, an atlas or something like that, and you say to somebody, point to New York on this map. Now, depending on their age, they're not going to take very long to do that. They're going to point they're going to point quite quickly. If you then say, okay, now point to Madrid, depending where somebody's from, they'll probably get it right or roughly right. But to point to it on the map, what they'll be doing is recognizing broad shapes. So they might be going, okay, I can instantly recognize North and South America. There's Europe. I know we're talking about Spain. I know that's down the bottom left. I know it's sort of in the middle of there somewhere. So what you're doing there is you're taking familiar shapes and using them to help you zero in on a point. You can do that with every single bit of the night sky with practice, because the stars don't move relative to each other in the same way that countries don't move relative to each other. So if we take the Madrid example, you turn the map upside down, you can do exactly the same exercise, because it may look a little bit sort of unusual and a bit foreign. The fact all the countries appear sort of upside down, you can still use the shapes to find that. You do exactly the same thing with the night sky. With practice, you get to know certain shapes. So we learn the Big Dipper or the saucepan or whatever we want to call it. And next we learn a shape which is like a stretched W called Cassiopeia. And then we learn how that takes us to the North Star. We then learn there are lots and lots of other shapes, and we learn the ways of getting from them. So I do like the kind of map analogy, because if you've never ever seen a map of the world, and somebody put one in front of you and said, point to Madrid, you're going to go, this is impossible. This is, I don't even know what I'm being asked to do here. But it's the same with the night sky. It's just nobody's ever sort of shown you where the countries are relative to each other, and the countries are the constellations. Now, it's like somebody's turning the map all the time, but the relationship stays the same. So if you know how to find, Los Angeles looking at a map of the world, it's exactly the same as finding a particular star in the night sky once you know the shapes to look for. And it's no more complex than that. It's just these days we learn where countries are, but we don't learn where the constellations are. But it's very easy to do.
I think that's why the age of exploration, for anybody who looks into it very seriously, is just so fascinating. We've had these passing thoughts over the years, especially when we learn about the expeditions of Christopher Columbus and others, where you have these really 15th century explorers who are, I mean, they're traversing all the seas of the earth just by really understanding the skies and whatever has been what has been mapped out. But it's really something else. I have to imagine that as far as the Vikings method of navigation goes, was that mostly predicated on what was going on in the skies as well?
Yeah, the Vikings, all pre-modern navigators were using similar and overlapping skills. So they would all use clues from the sky. So if we take Columbus as an example, finding direction using the sun and the stars, fairly straightforward. But one technique Columbus and everyone of that era, and to be honest, all of history up until the last 100 years, would have been very familiar with, is that the angle of the North Star above the horizon is your latitude. So you'll remember I said if you're standing at the North Pole, the North Star is directly over your head. So it's 90 degrees from the horizon to directly above your head. The North Pole, your latitude there is 90 degrees north. If you're at the equator, it's very hard to see the North Star, but in theory, it's sitting on the horizon. It's 0 degrees above the horizon. Your latitude at the equator is 0 degrees. And, for temperate zone places, you'd find it halfway up the night sky, 45 degrees above the ground. And you can actually gauge that without instruments, because if you stretch out your arm and make a fist, that measures roughly 10 degrees, 1/36th of a circle. But another way, if you go like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, it'll take 9 from the horizon to above your head. So if you're out on the ocean like Columbus, with even the skills and the limited equipment they had in those days, you can estimate direction within a couple of seconds, and it barely takes 5 seconds to gauge latitude roughly. Now, that's super simple, but a little bit rough. So what navigators decided to do is, well, let's try and measure it a little bit more accurately, because if we're a degree out, that's 60 miles, that's quite a lot. So they thought, how can we do it? Okay, what if instead of reaching out our arm, because that's not exactly, why don't we get a piece of string and then make a card at the end of it, and then we can fix the distance by holding the string with a knot between our teeth, and then a little wooden card fixes the angle there. That's a very simple instrument called the kamal, which has been used in the Middle East and Africa and places like that for hundreds of years, and to be honest, wherever anyone's been going to see in those areas as well. So the whole history of navigation, in a sense, is taking what we can do in a few seconds to get a rough estimate and just fine-tuning it. So the sextant does nothing more, literally nothing more, than measure angles quite accurately. That's all it does.
All right, so then here, I found another question I got to ask you before we go back to the ground level again, and that is, well, I guess it goes into weather and everything else. All right, you're navigating the Atlantic Ocean, and you are using the stars and whatever else going on there, and then it is just a very unlucky 3 days of cloud cover. You can't see the sky. What can the clouds tell you in a pinch about what direction you're going in, and how you can stay somewhat on track?
Well, in that situation, traditional navigators would use two things. They would read the sky. They'd also read the water. So in the sky, I in my books, I encourage the philosophy of nothing is random, and it's true. Sometimes there's so much going on, it's quite hard to unpick the exact story of everything that's happened. But if we start with a simple premise that clouds don't pop up for no reason. So the simplest clouds, cumulus clouds, the sort of fluffy ones, or what some people call the Simpsons clouds in terms of the opening credits, nice little ones going across the blue sky. They are always telling you that there's something warm below them. So you get more of them above towns, you get more of them above dark woodland, because those two heat up quicker than the surrounding areas. and you get more of them over islands. So navigators would use them to see, because they're always a lot higher than the land. You can always, when I was sailing to Iceland, for example, I saw clouds, a couple of days before a clear view of the land itself. And that's that's fairly standard. And then it gets down to a much more subtle art. And like all of these things, I use an analogy here. If we think of playing the piano, you can knock out some sort of noise with no training in 2 minutes. You just sit down there and you can make some sort of noise. To play something that is sublime, beautiful, and highly skilled, we're talking about years. So reading clouds is similar. You can do some amazing things within seconds. But in terms of the expert navigators, they were looking at subtle changes in the color on the underside of clouds. So, for example, in the Pacific, you get a slight tint of green over a lagoon. Or you get a slight. I see it around here in my home. There's lots of hills with dark woodland on the top, and because I practiced it for years, I can just see a very slight dark shade, which allows me to see where the wood on the hill is, even though I can't see the wood on the hill because it's behind trees. And then the waves, the water has a memory. So all land and all water has a memory for the wind. So trees, for example, in my book, How to Read a Tree, I give lots of examples of where you can read the fingerprints of the wind on trees, but out in the water, it's the same. The memory's shorter, but it's a lot longer than most people think. I was down in Cornwall in southwest England recently, and I was surfing on waves that were probably generated by a storm a week earlier in the middle of the Atlantic. So the water has a memory, and once you've tuned into the direction the waves are going, even if you've got a totally overcast sky, you get a sense of direction. If those waves then meet something, it creates patterns which gives you other information. But even in the middle of the ocean, navigators can tell which way they're going just from the wave patterns.
And obviously that's applied to land or sea, because clouds and stars are everywhere. That's okay. Now I'm glad I asked that one. So since I want to ask you about trees now, How to Read a Tree. This is your latest release, no?
Yes, yeah.
Well, the only thing I know about reading trees is when the tree is already down, has been cut apart, and we get to count the tree rings. That is the only thing I've ever known about them. But what is something, but then, of course, just in the media kit that I was sent of yours, on this, you left 4 did you knows here. Leaves with pale central streak mean water is nearby. Young, low-growing branches show that the tree is struggling. Reddish or purple bark signals new growth. This one is interesting. Branch direction. That can serve as a compass. This is just an example of the kinds of things that you learn in your books, which I hope everybody goes and checks out. They can find your entire library linked in your website, which is in the description of this episode. But let's just take one of those out of there. What do you think is the most important to know? Is it, once again, on a navigational standpoint, the branch direction?
I think the place to start is there's no such thing as a symmetrical tree. Nothing in nature is symmetrical, but we're focusing on trees here. If you ask someone to draw a tree, they'll draw a symmetrical one, but symmetrical trees don't exist because they are reflecting and adapting to the world they're in. So all we have to do is understand the fingerprints left by the sun and the wind, and every tree becomes a compass, and it also becomes a map. So let's just take the sun's kind of fingerprints and footprints it leaves in the landscape. We get more light from the south because the sun is due south in the middle of the day. Trees need sunlight, of course. It's their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So we find that they grow bigger on their southern side. So just from a distance, if you're totally new to this and looking for it for the first time, try and find an isolated tree. If you're lucky, you'll find a nice big one. Ideally, to start with a broadleaf deciduous tree on its own, and just have a good walk around it. You can do it summer or winter, but just have a walk around it, and you'll notice it's not symmetrical. And you'll just notice there's a bit more branches on the south side, because the tree is growing towards where it gets its energy from. The next thing to note is the angle of the branches. Now, trees don't know where the light's going to come from. They don't grow thinking, oh, south's there, let's go that way. They just respond to the light that they sense. So what they find is they're getting more light from the south side, and that leads the branches to grow directly out towards that light. Now, on the north side of the tree, there's not any direct light reaching there because it's shaded by its own southern branches. The only bright light that branches on the north side receive is from high above. So that means that what we find is if we say this is the north side of the tree, we find the branches on the north side are growing close to vertical. They're trying to reach the light coming from above the tree.
Right.
On the south side, there's lots of light coming in, and we find the branches going out towards that southern light. And this leads to an effect I call, in England, we call it ticks, the tick effect. In the US, I believe you call them checks, the check effect. And it looks like we've just got a sort of check across the shape of the tree. But these patterns are in every single part of the tree. Every leaf, every root, every trunk, every bit of bark is responding to the environment. It's responding to sun, to wind, to water. And so once we know how, we can think of it a little bit like tracking. Everybody I think knows what a dog's footprint looks like in sand or mud.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the same idea, that the sun and the wind are leaving these patterns on trees, and it just takes a little bit of an introduction to that idea, and then you start to see these patterns. And I won't pretend that the very first tree you look at is going to give you 10 examples of north really strongly, but I do guarantee if you look for this, over 3 or 4 trees and you spend a few minutes doing this, you will start to see some of these patterns, and they will start to give you a sense of direction.
Sense of direction, and of course, just a really amazing understanding of how nature works and how we respond, how everything in the ecosystem responds and is dependent on each other. And it's just it's tremendous. Now, one of the other things there you said was leaves with a pale central streak mean water is nearby. Now, I'd like to use this as a segue into something else, and hopefully we can fit in a couple more questions because I see time is running out, and I'd love to ask you one or two more. But finding water, we're talking about being on water and trying to find land, or just trying to get to where we need to go next. But what about being on land and needing to find water? We obviously we've heard about digging wells and just dig until you find something wet, but that can't just be all there is. What is the key to finding good water sources?
Yeah, it's a good question and a really fun, interesting area. If you speak to indigenous tribes people to this day, and certainly all through our history, if you told them that your way of finding water is to look for water, they'd find that funny, because it's a ridiculously crude way of looking for water. The way to find water is to understand the relationships between plants and animals and water. Every plant and every animal has to find water, including us. That's why we have so many cities on rivers. But if we think of the trees, we can pick any plant or animal. But if we think of the trees just for now, each family of trees, and in the book I make the point early on, we don't need to know the names of every single species, but it helps to know some very, very broad families. So it helps, even if we can't name them, to know that willows look a little bit different to pine trees, for example. So willows are a good example of trees that thrive on the edge of water. We tend not to find any in dry places, So what I encourage people to do is whatever, there'll be some fresh water near you. You might not pass it every single day, but it won't be far away. We human beings congregate around water. So what I encourage people to do is just notice the trees you see near that water. It can be a river, it can be a lake, it can be a pond, it can be a coastline. It really doesn't matter. And then as you move away, and I mean, not far, like 200 or 300 yards away, you'll notice the trees change quite dramatically. And we don't actually need to know the names of the trees. We just sort of say to ourselves, those are the sorts of trees I'm seeing at the water's edge. These are the sorts of trees I'm seeing when I've walked a few hundred yards away and maybe I'm on a little hill. And you do that a few times. And then as I keep coming back to you, the brain will take a shortcut. And you get this fantastic moment where you just get your brain saying to you, by the way, there's water over there. And you haven't even asked it, because it knows the pattern. Now, with a little bit of practice and curiosity, we start to notice that things like the insects, butterflies, birds, all of these things change dramatically as we get nearer to water. And you don't have to be an outdoors person at all to be able to do this. You just, every single time you're near a patch of water, you just say, okay, I'm going to take 20 seconds now. I'm just going to take a note of the plants, the trees, the animals I'm hearing and seeing. The sounds change completely. And then you do the same thing when you know you're a little bit away from the water. 20 seconds. Okay, I'm just going to take a note of that. do that 3 or 4 times over the next month, and you get to this point where your brain just says, okay, this is this is what I've been doing for tens of thousands of years. I'm glad you're finally doing it,
Yeah.
and it starts feeding you these cues. You get this sense. It's the same with the sun. It doesn't take long of saying to yourself, every time you see the sun in the middle of the day, that's roughly south, before your brain will just say to you, you might be driving somewhere and you just get a sense of where south is. You haven't even asked it. So these things are very fundamental. We're not asking our brain to do something like, software, which it really hasn't evolved to do. This is what we were born to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's a not even an upgrade. It's just plugging the line back in, plugging the Ethernet back in, and feeling and just understanding what's going on around you. So then let me ask you this then. We've talked about finding a little bit of information about what's going on around you just based on the smallest of dewdrops. What about desolate, extreme places? Let's talk about for example, what can be taken away from a sand dune in a desert. Is there anything useful, obviously, in a very rough situation, that if you don't have any prospects of, I don't know, any kind of gear or anything, you're probably you're probably screwed one way or another. But let's say you're not too bad off. What can a sand dune tell you?
Well, there's no patch of the Earth's surface where you can't pick up wind navigation clues, because the wind is always leaving these footprints, and it actually is very, very easy to read ones on the sand. So on a small scale, you don't have to go to the desert to practice these things. They work in the desert. I've used them in the Sahara and deserts in the Middle East and other places as well. But the truth is, you can practice these on a beach, or even in dust. On a street, you'll see some of these patterns. But every time the wind blows over the sand, it picks up some of the sand, and it moves it, and it creates patterns on different scales, a little bit like ripples and waves. So what we find is, even in harsh deserts, you'll find little obstructions, like little stones, occasionally tiny little clumps of very hardy grasses and stuff like that. There's always, all the way across the desert, there are little obstacles, and they block the wind flow, and you find these tails of sand running away from the obstruction. And then you find the wind is forming these major dunes. And the way sand dunes form, there are different shapes, but the general pattern is, we have the shallow side of the sand dune on the side the wind has come from, and a steeper face, what's known as the slip face, on the side the wind's been going towards. So all you have to do, and it's what I do before I even set foot in any desert, is form a relationship with the long-term wind patterns. Because the wind can blow from any direction on any one day, and in sandstorms it can do some really interesting things. But a lot of natural navigation is understanding the footprints the wind leaves, but that is only really useful once you've built a relationship with the wind. So wherever I go in the world, I quite often, before an aircraft's wheels have even touched the tarmac, I'm trying to understand what the long-term patterns there are. So if we take a very, very simple example, if we say that the prevailing wind, the direction the wind comes from, most often in a desert is from the south, every single sand dune is a compass. But if we don't build that relationship, all we're doing is seeing the patterns. We can't read them. So to read them, we have to build the relationship with the wind. So it's you can't, if you're dropped, you're never ever going to be dropped in a box and have absolutely no. So it's all about that early sort of curiosity to sort of say, okay, where am I? What has the wind been doing? And I'm put under pressure occasionally by journalists and others, and in my own training. And the more pressure I know I'm going to be under, the more sensitive I'm being, and the more curious I'm being about trends and patterns, because all of these things are easy to read, but we only read them if we have the curiosity to form a relationship with the things leaving the footprints, in this case, the wind.
In many cases, like in a desert, the atmosphere itself can be very dangerous and unforgiving, but in other places, just understanding local fauna is and flora, I guess, because danger can come in the form of a mushroom or a berry bush when it comes to outdoors. But the most obvious, I guess, we should go to next in my final two questions I have for you are animals. I know that you talk a little bit about this in some of your books there, especially when it comes to knowing whether or not you are being stalked, or how to track animals, whatever is going on. I mean, animals leave behind just as much information as, I would say, trees and plants and the wind does. So what are you looking for in particular when you talk about living creatures of the forest? What are you looking out for that?
Okay, so we can think of two broad areas to kind of sharpen our skills in: habitat and habits. So habitat, simple idea, every single creature has a home. So if we show enough curiosity to say, where do you live, then every time we see that creature, it's giving us a sense. So today, for example, I saw a lot of dragonflies. They are telling me I'm near fresh water. Now, I know there's a pond there, but as is so often with these things, we're building that relationship when we don't need it. And then occasionally I'll bump into it. I'm in a place doing a natural navigation exercise. I'll start to see dragonflies. They're telling me I'm getting close to the fresh water. So, but it applies to everything. It applies to the soil. You know, there are butterflies that will tell you, you know, the exact kind of pH of the soil you're walking over. But every animal has its home patch. It also has habits. So if we take a bird I saw today, the name of the bird and the type of the bird is not important. It's just an example I'm just going to throw out there because it's one I saw today. I saw a bird called a jackdaw, and it likes suburban areas. It doesn't like to be in the wild, and it doesn't really like to be in the middle of towns and cities. So it was telling me I'm near a town, but I'm not on the edge of the town. I'm out a little bit from it. It was on top of a tree, and its habit, like most birds, is to face into wind. So I was low down, lots of trees around me. I couldn't sense the wind, but all I had to do was look on top of this tree, and it was giving me a map through its habitat, telling me I'm quite near a town, but I'm not at the edge yet. And it's telling me exactly what the wind's doing. And so much of this subject is joining simple pieces together. And I find it a compliment when people say things like, well, it's kind of obvious when you think about it, or it's obvious in hindsight, because my work really is about all the stuff that, you know, there's a danger we get to the end of our lives and go, there's all this stuff I could have seen quite easily and didn't. And we can join some quite obvious jigsaw pieces together. So if there's a significant change in the wind direction, there's going to be a big weather change. So we join a few pieces together. We notice the birds were facing one way in the morning and they're facing a different way in the afternoon. That prompts us to notice, yes, there has been a wind direction change. Okay, there's a big weather change coming. So the animals can tell us huge amounts. You know, the body language. There's a book I wrote in North America. It's published as The Nature Instinct, which has a lot on animal body language and how that helps us predict. Everything is a sign, everything is a clue. So we can predict what a bird is going to do next. We can predict what a deer is going to do next, what a squirrel is going to do next. These things they cannot be complex, because all creatures, including us, survived by learning how to do this. It's about, you know, in terms of our ancestors, it was probably the only exam you had to pass, you know, if you see what I mean. You can get away with not being any good at all the subjects taught in school these days, pretty much, but you absolutely had to know that when the birds go from singing to tick, 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 and then silent, something nasty might be around the corner. That stuff you have to know.
You see, and that answered a question I didn't even ask, and that was, of course, how can this be applied to someone who lives in a big city, where so much? I mean, these days people talk a lot about. Everything, every need is met in a city. Resources available is usually at a flip of a switch or the turn of a knob. We hear more and more about these so-called 15-minute cities where everything's within walking distance that they want people to get jammed into. But the birds are still there, the squirrels are still there, and the signs are still. You still experience weather in a city, and that's how I guess. That was going to be one of the questions I wanted to ask about. How does this apply to people who are urbanites? And there you have it. Well, Tristan, you've been so gracious with your time, and you have such a wonderful library of work here that I hope people check out. What do you have coming up next? Because I know that you've led expeditions into 5 continents. Your work is nowhere near done because you're driven by a passion. So do you have any appearances coming up? Do you have any expeditions you're going to be leading? Obviously you have the new books on trees. What comes next for you?
I'm putting some time into something I've really enjoyed, which, if I'm honest, I wasn't sure if I would, which is sharing digitally and running online courses and things like that. Because in a perfect world, I would run courses in person with very, very small groups of people, but that really does narrow things. And COVID forced me to start developing things online. So I put huge effort into building resources online now. And on my website, naturalnavigator.com, you can get information about that. There's hundreds of photos and videos of clues and signs, and it's really nice for me because most people who have an interest in this subject can't get to where I run my courses. I do run physical courses, but there's at best a few hundred people a year will get on those, whereas thousands can learn online. And it's really nice for me because it through books and the online side of things, I don't want people to spend their lives on computers. That's obvious, but you can learn something on a computer, and then it adds a layer to your next sort of half an hour outdoors. And that to me is, that's the best of both worlds. If we use these tools to make our lives better, and increase our awareness and enjoyment of the outdoors, then we lose nothing.
Very well said. And thank you again for all the time tonight. Tristan Gooley, naturalnavigator.com. It's been wonderful to have you on.
Thanks so much, Frank. Really enjoyed our chat.
Okay. Take care.